Well, thank you all so much for joining us for our Experience Dyslexia workshop with the University of La Verne. I'm Jennifer Renner, part of the Project Arise team, and today we will be diving into part 2 of our series, and that's sharing the brain research behind dyslexia, as well as strategies and resources for supporting your students who are experiencing difficulties learning to read. And today we are very lucky to have Dr. Marga Maduri with us. And I just wanted, before we jump into her instruction for us today, I just wanted to remind you all that Project Arise offers free professional learning opportunities for educators across California in the form of workshops, just like we're doing today. We also offer communities of practice and asynchronous online courses. And so our goal is just to aspire to empower educators to elevate inclusive and effective literacy instruction for every student. So we really thank you all for being here today.
For the day.
Did you have a slide, Jen, that you needed to share?
I do. Are you not able to see my slides?
No.
Ooh, let me try again then. I apologize. I thought I had all my slides showing. What if it kicked me off
when I shared mine, probably.
I think so. Okay. There, are you all seeing that now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So we are delighted here to have from University of La Verne, we have Dr. Marga Maduri with us today, and she is going to take over and share with us all about the neuroscience behind the brain with learning to read and dyslexia.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. There is so much to cover. I won't get to it all, but I will make a dent. You know how it is when you have to decide what to include in a PowerPoint or a presentation and what to leave out. And of course, this is way too long and I was working on it right up until 5 minutes ago. So PowerPoints are never done. You just run out of time, right? So I'm a professor at the University of La Verne, and I have been teaching literacy for a long, long time. I'll get into that in a minute. Feel free to reach out. I will include my email again at the end, and I will share the link to these slides also at the end. So thank you for those of you that already introduced yourselves and put your role in the chat. If you haven't yet done so, please do. It's nice to see, especially so many early literacy people. That just makes sense, and interventionists too. So I'm a lifelong lover of reading, and I think it's kind of funny that this picture spans about 40 years or 50 years, and I almost look the same, like same position, same everything. And that second picture wasn't posed, it just happened that way. So I understand that not everybody loves literacy. I'm on a Facebook group of adults with dyslexia, and some of them have lifelong struggles because they never got support for learning how to read. And it's heartbreaking pretty much to see that. So how did I get to this place with dyslexia and structured literacy? I started as a teacher at a private elementary school. It was a K-8 school, actually. And I took the job. I was literally fresh out of college. I was 22. And I thought a small private school would be a good place to learn how to teach. But it turns out that this school actually served a lot of children with dyslexia, and comorbid is typical with ADHD. So many of our kids had ADD, ADHD also. And there were no supports for this. And they didn't tell me when they hired me that I was going to be working with kids with language learning disabilities. So it was a kind of a learn on the job issue. And when I left Countryside and I went to Glendale Unified, we had better support. We had special ed. We had resources and RSP. So I actually could serve those kids better at Rosemont, where I taught in Glendale. And my focus then, since I was middle school, was on engagement and motivation, because that was a bigger issue at the upper grades. I also didn't really have an understanding of early literacy instruction. I might have been able to identify kids and support them better had I known. But because we had a strong IEP and special ed program, those kids got the kind of support they needed at Rosemont. But I still didn't feel like I was good at teaching reading. I was good at teaching writing, and that was obvious. But reading happens in your head, and how do you gauge that? So I went back to school and got my language arts specialist credential, but the curriculum was more of a whole language sort of balanced literacy program where we did things like running records and queuing systems and reading inventories, all the things that basically we've learned do not help kids learn to read. We're basically teaching them to guess at words, not actually decode them, which is a little upsetting. We learn things like reading is a psycholinguistic guessing game. That's right out of one of my textbooks. Reading print is as natural as reading faces. Absolutely not true. Proficient readers should focus more on meaning than words. Reading should not be considered first and foremost a matter of identifying words. Well, that just makes no sense. How can you make sense of words if you cannot read them? And we have to focus on skills with free voluntary reading. If kids are reading a lot, they will learn to read. Well, they can't read a lot if they don't know how to read. And I saw this in my seventh grade class. I had kids that would bring catalogs and just turn pages during silent reading time. They were not learning to read by turning pages. So I went back for more school to get my doctorate in literacy and saw kind of firsthand some quality teaching in structured literacy, but there was a real issue there with engagement and motivation. Kids were learning to read, but at what cost? So finally, I got into the neuroscience of reading. I did a training at MIT and learned about how the brain learns to read, the physiology of learning and stress. And it's amazing that after so many years of school, this is the first time I was exposed to the physiology of learning and the brain stuff. Why don't we learn that stuff? That should be part of our undergraduate or certainly our credential programs. So I did a mind brain teaching certificate at Hopkins, which was very good, highly recommended. And the mind brain health education course at Harvard. So now I have a much deeper understanding of the neurology of reading. So here are some of the things I learned. Language evolved maybe 100,000 years ago. We are wired to learn to speak. And most people, like 99% of the population, barring any really severe cognitive challenges, can learn language. Literacy, however, is only 6,000 years old. It's really a baby in terms of evolution, and we have not wired our ability to learn to read. We haven't evolved that. It's not natural. We have to usurp existing structures from language learning and create new neural pathways and multiple connections in order to be able to read. And Louisa Moat said it best, teaching reading is rocket science. There's a whole, and it's a deep understanding of language in order to learn to read. So our brains are only about 3.5 pounds, about 2% of our body mass. They use 20% of our oxygen and 20% of the calories we consume. In other words, as Dr. Alman says, your brain is the most metabolically expensive real estate in your body, which I just love that quote. It costs a lot to think and to learn, which is why it can be so exhausting for kids that struggle, right? For those of you that were in the dyslexia simulation last week and had to explore doing some challenging tasks where we purposely made it difficult for you, think about a kid doing that all day long where their brain is having to work so hard. It's exhausting. If you want to get a sense of your brain, hold your hands out like this, straight out in front of you, hook your thumbs together, make fists, and then fold it in. And that really is it. That's our brain. Doesn't that seem smaller than it should be? Right, Sarah, trying to fit it in your head. I know, right? Um, so it's not the size of our brain that matters, but it's the number of connections between our neurons that matter. And I'm going to talk about that here. We have like 85 billion neurons in our brain, which is the gray matter, and 85 billion more glial cells, which is the white matter. That's like unfathomable. There are 62,000 miles of myelinated axons. Those are the ones that through practice and repetition make things become automatic. We have 100,000 miles of dendrites. And I'm going to share this PowerPoint so you can feel free to copy the slide. And there's 15,000 connections for one neuron, which means we have like 100 trillion synapses in the brain. And that's 100 followed by that many zeros down at the bottom. It's like crazy. So all those things happen for us to just function. And then learning to read, I'm going to talk about in a minute. So we have these major lobes in our brain that are supportive, and we need to build connections between all of them. The frontal lobe, or executive functioning, reasoning, problem solving, and speech, Broca's area, which is here on the left part of the frontal lobe. Then we have the temporal lobe, hearing, that's kind of where our ears are. Wernicke's area, which is listening, speech comprehension. The parietal lobe, up here, sensations of taste and temperature and touch and proprioception, knowing where we are in space. Like if I put my hand back here, I know my hand is there. I don't have to see it because I have proprioceptive nerves. And then the occipital lobe in the back, which is actually where, when we see something through our eyes, the first place it goes is in the back of the brain. So these are important. I'll get to it in a minute. So why are we having this discussion tonight? How many of you have seen The Reading Ladder by Nancy Young? Okay, so you know that most of our kids fall around 40 to 50%, where they need specific explicit instruction in learning to read. About 35% of our kids, let's see, there we go. 35% of our kids are going to learn to read kind of pretty much whatever we do. 5% of our kids are going to figure it out no matter what. But 60% of our kiddos need explicit structured literacy instruction. And unfortunately, our teachers are kind of reversed. Most of our teachers fall in that 5%. They learn to read. I mean, like what I'm saying, 60% of our teachers learn to read without pretty much any effort. And only about 10 to 15% of our teachers struggled with learning to read. So we have a large population of teachers that are very efficacious in reading. It was easy for them. They figured it out, no problem. And yet they're teaching a population of kids that is reverse of that. So this is, I think, one of the issues and why there's always been some issues about and conflict about teaching to read, because our teachers never struggled. They didn't understand really what it's like to have a difficulty with learning. If you want to learn more about this book by Stanislaw Dewan is fabulous. And this video that I'm showing, I'm just showing a very small clip of it, but I recommend you can watch the whole video. It's about an hour long where he talks about the processes of reading in the brain. And the book is excellent, written for lay people. So just FYI, he has a new book out, which is great, about how we've evolved being able to see what's going on in our heads. It's very, very cool. And let's just watch a little clip of him showing us what happens when we read one word in our brains. Oh, hang on, let me share the sound here. Okay, and I'll blow this up. Okay.
So how does that work? Well, this is a picture of your left hemisphere. The left hemisphere of the brain is most essential for language and reading. And just to orient you, this is the back of the brain, this is the front of the brain. It's been slightly inflated so you can see inside the folds. And now I want to show you the activation of the brain as you read one word. We see it in time. So let me start this. Here we go. And you have the word unfolding from the back of the brain to the...
Is anybody else having, are you seeing the video? You are. Okay, Kristen says she's not. I'm not sure what to do about that.
I can see both screens. I think Jennifer is still sharing.
Ah, okay.
The front of the brain. It will loop several times. You can see the information enters into the occipital pole, which is the visual side of the brain, moves into the ventral areas and then explodes into the left hemisphere distributed activity.
Okay, so the takeaway from that
So how
is
does that
that,
work?
hang on.
Well, this...
Let me stop him here. And let me blow this up again. Is that we have these,
So how does that...
Just go to the next one, thank you. Okay, so we have these cortical networks. Are you seeing the slide that says cortical networks for reading? Just making sure, okay. So this comes from him. And it's not as much, one thing that we need to think about, we have centers of language, like I talked about Broca's area and Wernicke's area, but really it's the networks that we need to build in order to be able to read. So what we saw in the video, the first thing that lights up is the back of the brain when we're looking at one word, and that's the occipital lobe. And then it goes to this ventral occipital temporal area, which he calls the brain's letterbox or the visual word form area, where we have learned to map the shapes of letters. And then near the language processing area, we match the letters with the sounds. So it's like this all these different regions together need to be networked in order for us to make sense of one word. Reading connected text is so complex, they can't even measure it because there's even more networks that are involved when you read a sentence or a paragraph. There's right side of the brain, which deals with comprehension and big picture issues, and frontal lobe, which is making decisions about what we read. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit too. So it's incredibly complex. And as far as I'm concerned, it's probably more surprising that most of us get it rather than some people don't, because it's just so complex being able to read. And again, it's not wired. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about speech and language because literacy rests on a sea of language. Mark Seidenberg said that children's entry into reading and how fast they progress depends on their knowledge of speech. Because it is so crucial to becoming a reader, measures of pre-readers' spoken language are strong predictors of later progress. And for those of you that have watched some of the RDRS videos, introductions about the different reading screeners that are coming out in the fall, that's really what we're looking at there. So we can take children that have not yet learned literacy and evaluate their language abilities or their speech abilities and their recall and get a sense of whether or not they might be at risk for struggling as readers. Not necessarily dyslexia, but for struggling with reading. Infants learn language or languages in less than a year. They are born already being able to identify the sounds of their mother's language or languages. They measure that by heart rate and by suckling, and they can tell children that are responding to their mother's language. But when babies first hear words, it's like an acoustic blob. They hear cat, that sounds like one sound to them. But as they increase their vocabulary and they hear cat and cake and cup and car, then they can start distinguishing. Yes, they all start with k, but then there's these other pieces that come after. So they can increase their ability to identify distinct phonemes. But that's only in service of speech. This is a terrible slide, and I apologize for it, but it was so important I had to include the content. Oral language is so complex. Conversational speech among adults in English takes place at about 180 to 225 words per minute. And I don't know what that is in Spanish, but I'm a Spanish learner, and it sounds like they speak twice as fast. And anybody that's learned a language knows that a native speaker speaks far faster than we can like catch it and decode it. How many of you have had to learn a language and ask people to slow down so you can understand what they're trying to say? Yes, thank you, Eve. Okay, so while working at the speed, what does a listener do? Speaker has to construct the meaning, has to choose from about 40,000 different alternatives, has to sequence items according to syntax or language rules, assign appropriate inflections, use more than 100 muscles to produce the whole thing, and follow rules of social interactions. You think about all that happening within a minute, it's incredible, right? And then the listeners have to perceive the signal, retrieve the meaning, distinguish from a stream of sounds between 5 to 8 syllables or 25 to 30 phonemes per second when there's overlapping borders between meaningful units. I mean, communication is complex, right? Just this alone is a myth. And people need to master this in order to be able to learn to read. So it's like complexity within complexity. So you can say to yourself, well, if language is automatic, then what about phonological processing? Yes, so phonological processing is being able to process sounds in language. And yes, that's automatic in the service of speech. But in order to be able to do this in terms of reading, we need to have, there's more specific skills that we need to have. As it says at the bottom there, reading and spelling require a level of metalinguistic speech that is not natural or easily acquired. So it goes past what we need to be able to do just to be able to have conversations. All right, so let's compare languages. You say, well, okay, English is really hard, but what if I were learning to speak another language or read in another language like Spanish? Spanish is considered transparent. There's a one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. English is considered opaque. There's like 44 sounds in the English language, but only 24 letters. So there's nowhere near a one-to-one correspondence. But the language regions of the brain, regardless of the language you're learning in, as you can see on these pictures, are pretty similar. So the difficulty with reading is not the language that you're learning it in, it's language centers in general. So children with language difficulties are going to have a harder time learning to read, regardless of what language they're learning it in. And if we compare brains, we see that. They've done MRIs comparing typically developing brains in children with dyslexia, and we see distinct brain differences, especially in those two regions that I pointed out, the visual word form area and in Broca's area. And they've shown that intervention can make a difference. So for example, if we look at this first picture up here, typically developing brain, we see the brains sort of activate in reading words here in that visual word form area and here in Broca's area. Children with dyslexia, we see much less engagement. But after interventions, and I've read this paper and I've went to Dr. Gabriele's presentations, with not very good intervention, we can create those networks in children with dyslexic brains. So that's the exciting thing. So now let's talk about what is dyslexia. How many of you have seen this definition or similar version to it? And I just want to share that there are discussions, and I don't think I have that slide in here, with updates to the definition, adding different pieces. But in a nutshell, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin, characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities, which typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. In other words, it's processing the sounds that seems to be the basis. And I've looked at current studies, and that has been supported in current studies as well. Secondary consequences include comprehension problems, and because children that have not been readers, they also are impeded in the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And I'll give you an example of Joseph. He was an 8th grader when I met him. In 4th grade, they assessed him and decided he did not qualify for an IEP or special ed, but they did give him some accommodations, extra time in class to work on reading and papers, which didn't help him and it didn't teach him how to read. So when I got him in the 8th grade and assessed him, he was still reading at the 4th grade level, hadn't grown in 4 years of school. And because he hadn't grown and he hadn't been a reader, his background knowledge was low and his vocabulary was low for his grade level. So it's heartbreaking. If we don't catch these kids soon, they just kind of stay stuck wherever they got and don't grow and just get farther behind. So the highlights here in the definition, that is a phonological processing issue, manipulating speech sounds and the impaired ability to link letters and sounds. It affects about 15 to 20% of the population. It's 50% or higher heritable, and it's often co-related with high IQ or giftedness, ADHD, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. So there's lots of other things going on for our dyslexic kids too. Just a side note, we may not be the only ones that have neurological problems. Like I found this quote in this book, Sad Animal Facts. Whales that are tone deaf get lost in the ocean. And I looked that up, and there actually is this whale, 52, that sent out signals at 52 hertz, but all the other whales are at 57. So this poor whale doesn't hear them and they can't hear him. And then just last summer, there was another study about a sort of alphabet identified in sperm whales, where there's sort of a phonetic alphabet that has like 9,000 different sound symbols, they call it. Anyway, so we're not the only ones that have issues. So I'm going to pause here for a second and stop sharing. Anybody have a thought, a comment, something new, something old? No? Okie dokie then. I will continue. Okay, so just a cautionary note, not all reading difficulties are caused by dyslexia. So students who struggle are maybe those that have, like I said, phonologically based issues, which are typically our dyslexic kids, but there are also kids with language comprehension based difficulties. So they may not have a problem with decoding or matching letters and sounds. Their problem may be more language based, either if they struggle with the English language in general, or they don't know English, or they just have language comprehension issues, not necessarily connected with phonological processing issues. And of course, we have kids with both of those challenges. And we have to be careful when we're talking about our ELs, and I'll get to them in a minute too. Certainly, we don't want to over-identify them, but also we don't want to just say, well, they're a language learner. Once they learn English, they'll be fine, because that doesn't work either. And a lot of kids have been left behind because they just, well, they're English learning. Once they learn English, they'll be fine. That's not necessarily the case. Okay, so in pre-literate societies, prior to 6,000 years ago, and I think the Greeks were the ones that first adopted literacy sort of as a culture, who would have been dyslexic? We don't even know. So my question is, are dyslexic brains just kind of typically developing brains who are wired differently? Because many times dyslexics are out of the box thinkers, are creative thinkers, are gifted kids. Not all of them, but there's certainly many of them. So that's just sort of my own question. Is it sort of an evolutionary part that, again, because reading isn't natural or evolved, it wouldn't have mattered in terms of evolution? Okay, this was something that I found disturbing. About a third of our teachers think that kids just have who claim to have learning or attention issues are just lazy. 43% of our parents wouldn't want others to know their child had a disability, and 54% who go to doctors ignore the recommendations to get help. Well, why did you go to a doctor if you're not going to follow the recommendations? So these are some of the things we're up against. And of course, we have the myths of dyslexia, right? People think the big one is that people think it's reversibles, saying letters backwards, and that we can fix dyslexia, or that kids outgrow dyslexia. But of course, it's a continuum like everything else. Sometimes it can be very slight, it doesn't impact you very much, and sometimes it can be very, very stressful and difficult to learn literacy. But we can intervene, and we can teach kids with dyslexia to read. Prevention is obviously much, much better than remediation. So with the new screener coming out next year, I'm hoping that we can start catching these kids earlier on. The screener law is for kindergarten through second graders. So we can identify kids that might be at risk for reading difficulties and intervene sooner. We can provide high quality level 1 teaching at that tier 1 level, and then identify kids that need extra tier 2 or tier 3 support for intervention. So what about letter reversals? It's common in developing readers. We are wired to see something. If I look at a chair and I see it backwards, I see it upside down, I still know it's a chair. But letters are about the only thing we have to actually learn to see unidirectionally. So that's one of the challenges with kids, is just they confound it because we're not wired to be able to do that. So a typically developing kid by around the end of first grade, early second grade, will pretty much have a sense of what letter B looks like and what a letter D. So if you have a kid that's still struggling with that by middle of second grade or so, probably there's something that can be a trigger. I'm just going to stop there. Okay. So the simple rule of reading, you've all seen this simple view, right? And that's all fine and well. And you've also seen the reading rope. So what I like what Scarborough did was she broke down that simple view of language comprehension and word recognition, said, each one of those is really complex. And of course you can add in, and I don't think I have that slide here. Oops. I didn't mean to take it to, you can add in executive function skills here, because we need the executive function skills. Lori Cutting talks about that, to be able to build fluency. So executive function skills, meaning being able to stay focused, being able to stay on target, being able to practice reading difficult text over and over and over again until we become fluent. Those are all executive function things. And a lot of times our dyslexic kids who also have ADHD are going to struggle with that. So they're kind of have a double challenge that they're working through. Okay, so the problem, I think, in our schools has been a poor understanding of how to teach reading, which has led us through the reading wars. I started teaching in 1987, and this has been an ongoing debate. What's the best way to teach reading ever since I've been teaching? We have issues in teacher education, administration, classroom teachers. And if you'd like to learn more about that, the Sold the Story, who's already listened to the Sold the Story podcast, right? It really lays it out well. And I'm definitely one of those people. I was one of the 7th grade teachers she talked about in that podcast. And then there's a great article, Ending the Reading Wars, which really tracks the research on literacy instruction, what's the best way to teach reading, and tracks the difficulties and sort of shares like, okay, we know now. We know better. We know how to teach reading. reading is the most researched educational skill by far than anything else. There's more research on reading than there is on math, on writing, on anything else. We know there's, they call it the science of reading. There's tons and tons of work that talks about how explicit structured literacy is important. So now we have our screenings coming to identify who might be risk, and we can identify high quality tier 1 evidence-based instruction, because if we can prevent reading difficulties, that trumps intervention every time. If we catch a kid at kindergarten, first grade level and provide good quality intervention, they will not have reading problems. And of course, we all know some of the social emotional issues that happens for our kids that struggle. 2 to 5 times greater emotional challenges with their peers, challenges with self-esteem, increased behavior problems, so school failure, dropping out, the school to prison pipeline, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know you've probably all seen this with your kids that struggle. All right, so structured literacy, we owe our thanks to Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham, who Samuel Orton sort of identified word blindness, is what he called it, kids that otherwise didn't seem to have any cognitive issues but could not read, who worked with Anna Gillingham to develop the methods for teaching reading. She had a deep knowledge. She was a psychologist and an educator and had a deep knowledge of the language. And really, that was in the early 1920s when she developed her first Gillingham reading methods that we're still really relying on today. All of our OG-based programs are founded in the work of Anna Gillingham back in the 1920s, because it so far seems to be the best for supporting kids that need it. Okay, so explicit structured literacy is made up of, it's systematic, which means that we have predictable content delivery. We teach in the same way. It's explicit. We don't assume prior knowledge. We clearly state what's being taught. It's multisensory. We use visual, auditory, kinesthetic pathways. It's sequential. There's a scope and sequence. We start with the simplest concepts and build to the more complex concepts. Diagnostic and data driven. As much as we can, lesson by lesson, we evaluate what the child did, what they got, what they still need, and then we tweak our teaching to match their needs, and it's cumulative. A lot of the research on how we learn shows that spaced learning, where we spread it out over time, and interleaving, where we weave it in. So what I teach today, I will review again in the next 3 lessons, and then it will be woven into the rest of my teaching. So all of these things are explicit and structured literacy, and this is what Orton Gillingham is pretty much based on. Okay, a few more notes. Orton Gillingham lessons or structured literacy lessons have a high level of student-teacher interaction with prompt corrective feedback. And I love this. OG lessons are relentlessly cumulative. I like that, relentlessly cumulative. So how many of you are familiar with UFly? Okay, so the University of Florida Literacy Institute, that's where this one comes from. They started putting their materials online for free during COVID because they wanted teachers to have good structured literacy instruction. And it became so popular that they published a manual that you can buy for about $70, and it is worth every penny. It's the teacher's manual, and then all the resources are available for free online. So if you're teaching a lesson at SH, you can go to the UFly site, download the PowerPoint. The manual will tell you how to walk it through. The PowerPoint will be what you show your kids, and you can teach right from there. You can teach yourself. They have foundational videos. There's UFly Facebook groups. There's UFly website. Fabulous stuff. But all these other programs are also Orton Gillingham based or structured literacy based. 95%. Is anybody using 95%? One of the districts I work with, West Covina, they use it. A lot of the districts I'm working with now are bringing in UFly sort of as a grassroots thing. So basically, these curriculums kind of can walk you through it. But if you understand the approach, if you understand the depth of knowledge, then you can become diagnostic and prescriptive. You can understand when to review something, what the kids might need. If you have to leave something out, which piece would you leave out depending on the group that you're working with? And it requires a lot of training and practice, as Jennifer Renner here knows and Sam Glassford knows, because they've seen the dyslexia program that I am working in. So it can be very intensive, but it's absolutely going to provide you enough background to be able to approach these programs with a deeper knowledge so you can meet individual kids' needs. So in a structured literacy lessons, we teach phonemic awareness, identifying and manipulating sounds and words. We teach phonemes, which are the unit of sounds and words. We teach children to identify graphemes, a letter or letters that spell sounds, and morphemes, which are the units of meanings, the affixes, prefix, suffixes, bases, and base words. Okay, in an OG lesson, we have, we introduce one new concept at a time. Students might say the sound, trace the letter, spell it, listen for it in target words, and then read and spell those words with that pattern. They practice phonemic awareness, manipulating sounds and words, and they practice heart words or red words, which I will talk about in a minute, that have irregular spellings. So for example, if you're a first grader and I were teaching you the concept CH digraph, I would say, this is a CH digraph. The sound it spells is ch, as in the word chip. And then I would have you say with me, name and trace the letters in CH, CH, and say the sound it spells ch. Do that 3 times. So hold out your fingers, trace CH, CH, CH. Okay. Then I would say, how do we spell the digraph? And you're going to say the sound, and then you're going to trace the letters CH. So how do we spell the digraph? CH, CH. Then we're going to write it. Write what spells the digraph. So you get your paper and you're going to say the sound, and then you're going to write and name the letters as you trace it. CH, CH, CH. With me so far? So that right there is 9 exposures to you're shaping your mouth. And if kids need help with that, we teach them how to shape their mouth to say that sound. They're tracing the letters, they're writing the letters, they're connecting the letters with the new sound they've just learned. Okay, then I'm going to read some words. Repeat the word, give me a thumbs up if you hear the ch and a thumbs down if you don't. So say chop, chop. Do you hear ch in the word chop? Yeah, so thumbs up. Say beach. Do you hear ch in the word beach? Good. Say ship. Do you hear the ch in the word ship? No. Tricky one. It's close, but it's not quite. So that's the phonemic awareness where we're relating, we're connecting the sounds of the pattern just taught to words. Then we're going to read words with our pattern like chap or such or chomp or bench or chug. And then we're going to do our strategic decoding. And this is one of my favorite parts of this lesson. Let's see, I had this here. This is Gianna. She was a 2nd grader when I started with her, and she could not blend. She didn't know, she knew most of her letters and sounds, but she couldn't blend them together, like AM, she couldn't blend AM. And this is after about lesson 6, I think. So she's learning the short U. Oh, hang on, I'm not hearing a sound. There we go, let me try again.
Pattern, that means
Do you hear it?
I have 1 syllable. U, consonant.
Wait, trace the U.
U, consonant.
And what's the word?
Shut.
Brilliant. Okay, so what you saw there was her identifying the vowel pattern in the word, knowing that the vowel pattern U consonant is a closed syllable and it makes the sound. And as you probably know in English, the vowels are the most difficult because they make a multitude of sounds. So if you can identify the syllable type, that will help you identify how to pronounce the vowel. That right there is my favorite part of this program, teaching kids to identify the syllable types and the vowel sounds, because that's the key to unlocking words. So in a 2-syllable words like this one, what we would do here is I would say I see 2 vowel patterns. That means I have 2 syllables. I look for 2 consonants between the 2 vowel patterns. I see 2 consonants divide between them. First syllable, E. Consonant, it's a closed syllable, den. Second syllable, I consonant. It's a closed syllable. I, tist, dentist, dentist. And what this does is it gives children the opportunity to have a structured format for decoding multisyllabic words or single syllable words rather than guessing. And when you're working with older kids, the older they get, the harder it is to break the habit of guessing. And Jen's nodding because she tutored older kids. Sarah, I'm guessing you have too. It's really hard to undo that. They see the first two letters, like my little guy AC that I tutor, he sees COM and the word is computer. Doesn't matter what comes after COM, even if it's COME, it's computer because computer starts with COM. And it's just like so hard to break them of that habit of guessing, which is why we need to get it earlier on. So are you all familiar with the different syllable types? We use the acronym CLOVER to represent the different types: closed syllable, consonantal E, open, vowel team, silent E, and are controlled. So teaching kids to identify these patterns, and you teach them how to code them, they're going to be able to learn to read them in unknown words. Okay, so for strategic encoding, I dictate the word, they identify how many syllables, they tell me what's the syllable, what's the sound. So say the word chimp, chimp, I hear one syllable. What's the vowel sound in chimp? I. How do we spell I? Well, I is a closed syllable, so I pronounce I consonant. Now I'm going to spell chimp. So the first sound in chimp is ch, is CH, I, M, E. So we're teaching them to identify the sounds and then say what letter matches that sound. And this again, for our kids that have tried to guess their way around things, gives them a very structured way to strategically encode words. And this is what readers do. You may have these words automatically, but actually it's what's happening in your brain. We just slow it down for these kids, give them a format, so eventually it will become automatic to them too. Okay, red words. We teach the heart word method. So when I was in teacher ed at school in my day, we just taught them to memorize. We were told you have to memorize these words. They don't do what you're expected. They don't follow the phonics rules, so you just have to memorize them, which is not true. Many of these words have parts of them that follow the phonics rules. Like take the word said. So what we do is we teach kids to identify the parts that follow the rules and the parts that don't, and you only have to learn those parts by heart. So for example, say the word said. How many sounds do you hear in said? S, d. 3 sounds. Okay, and now we're going to look at which parts of said do what we expect. So the S in said says, that's what we expect. The D in said says d, that's what we expect. It's the AI that don't do what we expect, right? AI usually spells A, but in this word it spells eh. So we put a heart underneath because that's the part we have to learn by heart. And then we're going to have the child name and trace. They're going to say said, S-A-I-D, said, S-A-I-D, 3 times. And then we're going to ask them to remember which of those do we need to learn by heart. So again, there's a process for learning words that don't typically follow the typical phonics rules. Okay, then we get to review learning. There's a card pack here. This is building automaticity. We want kids to be able to identify letters and sounds automatically, so when they see them in the words, they don't have to stop and think about it. So this is Amina. She was a 7th grader here, just practicing the card pack.
Okay, so we're going to do our card pack. You're going to trace the letters and then tell me the sound or sounds they make. And you have 3 minutes. Ready? Go.
C, C, H.
So say the letters and then the sound.
G, L, go. S, K, sk. O, consonant, O. N, P, N. A, consonant, silent, E.
And then when they make a mistake, I'm not going to go into it. If she makes a mistake, I tell her the correct spelling or the correct sound. She retraces it 3 times. I put it back in the pack for one more practice. So this gets faster and automatic, and this helps kids just when they come to those patterns in words, they know it. And if they forget, sometimes just by tracing A, consonant, silent E, they go, oh yeah, it's the A sound. So we do the card pack, we do a blending drill where they practice with nonsense patterns, because a lot of our kids, especially the brighter ones, have memorized words. So if they see the word, they kind of have memorized what it is and they're not decoding. So we give them nonsense words so they actually have to use their decoding skills. We spell sounds in isolation, we read words with those patterns, we spell words with those patterns, we dictate sentences, and we practice reading. So in this review part, everything in this review is stuff they've already learned. There's only one new thing taught in each lesson. In the new learning, there's that CH concept, for example. They practice phonemic awareness, they learn the new red words, and then everything else is review. So there's that constant, like I said, relentlessly cumulative. Okay, so in short, our lessons have a new learning with direct instruction. We have phonemic awareness practice where they're identifying and manipulating sounds in words, both targeting the new learning they just got and also other practice patterns. They're reading words with the new learning and spelling words with the new and review learning, and they're reading text at the end to practice using their skills in the context of connected text. I wanted to add this slide. Monica Aguirre from the San Diego County Office of Ed gave me her notes, and these are things that we need to think about when we're working with our multi-language learners. So do we, in terms of consideration for dyslexia, so some of the questions are, what is their proficiency in spoken English and in their home language? So kids that struggle in their home language might have some language-based issues, and you need to find somebody that can assess that for you. Is a student bilingual or multilingual? If so, consider how dual language brain research informs the possibility of dyslexia. So I was working with Edwin, and I started with him in the middle of third grade, and Spanish was a language spoken at home, and he was struggling. And when you ask him a question like, hi, Edwin, how are you today? He might take a couple of minutes to even answer the question, even if you had like a chart that said, you know, the pictures, how are you feeling today? And they pick one. He might take a few minutes to do that. And I was wondering, and I was told by his teacher, if he just had a processing issue, if he was just a slow processor. But actually, over my work with him in time, it turns out, no, he was just having a problem identifying when he went to the language centers of his brain, which language do I use? And English was not a very solid language for him because he mostly spoke Spanish at home and he wasn't a reader. So when he went to try to find the words like how are you and to answer that, the first words that popped up in his head were in Spanish. So then he had to dig through that to get to the English words and then be able to produce those English words. By the end of our time together, and I went back and assessed him in the beginning of fifth grade, he was much more fluent. English was grounded, and he could actually recall and have conversational speech more at a regular rate because he'd spent so much time with me working in the English language. So those are things we need to think about. I do think he had a language learning challenge, but it was resolved by spending a lot of time in the language. So we also can consider, I talked about opaque or transparent. Is the home language transparent, like Spanish in his case? And then English is opaque, so much more difficult to learn. And finally, are the assessments used to evaluate these kids valid for the intended purpose? And fortunately, if my understanding of the assessments that were chosen for the RDRS, 3 out of 4 of them were approved for both English and Spanish, and they did a really nice job developing them. I'm impressed. So I think what we're going to get in terms of Spanish results are good. The multitudes assessment is building a Mandarin Chinese version as well. Right now they just have the Spanish and English. So that's exciting. I think we have good choices here in our state for assessment. So when we're working with our upper grade kids, we need to remember that English is morphophonemic, meaning that English words are based both on sounds and the meaning. So if you take the word health, for example, health and heal are related, but we pronounce them differently, but notice that the spelling is the same. And if you think of other words like, I'm going to put it in the chat here, take the word they and their and say and said. Look at the chat for a second and look at those 2 words. What do you see? What patterns do they share? You can unmute or put it in the chat. I agree, we can intervene without IEPs. We just need a trained interventionist to do that. Yeah, they have the long A sound. So my point is the word they ends with EY. That's the vowel team that says A. When you put EY in the middle of the word, we change the Y to an I. So you can see the relationship between they and their, just like with say and said. When we take AY at the end of a word, but it goes in the middle of a word, it becomes an I. So said is actually related to say. And if you can remember said, that actually might help you. Okay. So when we're working with our upper grade kids, giving them that level of comprehension to understand how to spell and why spellings are the way they are, teaching them the syllable types and how to decode, how to divide multisyllabic words, like I'm doing here with teaching her the Greek bases or Greek combining forms. Teaching morphology and the layers of English is also incredibly valuable for those upper grade kids. And we could still do phonemic awareness in those upper grade kids too. Sometimes that can really help them if they can start hearing the sounds and words, especially important for spelling. We can't spell a word if we can't break down the sounds. So talking about layers of English, if you want a really good short little book that's filled with all kinds of great stuff, this is the one. Anglo-Saxon, but also Sue Hegelin, by the way, is doing a talk tonight at 5:30. Right when I'm done, I'm jumping on. She did the book Beneath the Surface of Words and talking about spelling. So you can probably still sign up through the Reading League. Yes, great way to build vocabulary for sure. Thank you, Jen. So 20% of our language is Anglo-Saxon, and that's our BICS. Simple one-syllable words most common for speaking. 55% of our language is Latin-based, and the bases carry the brunt of the meaning, like in the base rupt, which means to burst or break. So disrupt, to burst or break apart, interrupt, to break in between. Spect means to look or see. So respect, to look again. Respectable, able to be respected, able to take another, like worthy of taking another look at it. Inspect, to look in. Retrospect, to look back. So we can teach these, one base here, and kids can get insights to tons of words just by a simple base like rupt or spect. Then our Greek combining forms are basically almost like our Anglo-Saxon compound words. You have tele and you have phone. Tele means distant or far. Phone means to hear. So a telephone means to hear from a distance. Telegraph, graph means an image or a picture. So telegraph, to hear something or read something from a distance. And just a little aside, the monks, as you probably know, when they were writing, when they were transcribing Anglo-Saxon from the oral to the written, we had Germanic words that had 44 sounds using a Latin alphabet that only had 23 letters. So part of what they did was made up letters. Part of what they did was kind of fudged things around. For example, they decided that English words don't end in J. So they came up with the DGE and the to end words. So we know DGE is at the end of a word with a short vowel sound. Then we had problems with spelling because we had the great vowel shift right after dictionaries were and the printing press had come out. So we had spellings that sort of were locked in, but our pronunciations changed. So that made a problem with words like the word night, N-I-G-H-T, which would have been pronounced nicht, but we changed our pronunciation, but we kept the spelling. And then, of course, this is a fun, like some of what the copyist wrote. Like the parchment is hairy, the ink is thin. Thank God it will soon be dark. Oh, my hand. Poor guys. Another thing I think you need to know is the different jobs of silent E. So we all know that silent E makes a short vowel long, like in the word bite or name. But E is also plural canceling, like in the word horse. The S at the end of horse, it doesn't mean there's more than one whore. It's one animal. So we put an E there to show that that S isn't a plural S or the word mouse. It's not more than one mao. It's a single mouse. So the E there is to show us that S isn't a plural S. The E can make us a G soft or a C soft, like in the word bridge or prince. English words don't end with V or U, so they added the silent E there. That's why it's give, not give, or have, not have. And I think this is so that there wasn't a J at the time, so they created the DGE and the GE to replace the J sound. So these are all different things that the E does that most kids didn't learn. I never learned this. I think we knew it sort of implicitly, but it was not something actually taught. So if you're working with groups of kids, you can start with phonemic awareness, identifying the syllables in words, and you can jump the syllable, one dog, two raccoons, rhinoceros. So four could also be a good time to get up and move. Teaching the syllable types, which is really important, which can help with syllable division. And I love some teacher that came up with this, right? So clever. I've never even heard of Mike and Ike. Is that still a candy that you can get? Is it really? Oh, okay. How about
Like jelly
Rolos?
beans, they're my kids' favorites.
You're kidding. Wow. Okay. I never liked jelly beans. If I was going to eat candy,
Me
give me
either.
chocolate. I'm not wasting my time on fake fruit things. I'll eat real fruit if I want fruit. Okay. I'm not going to get into this right now. So let me pause for a second. Questions, comments?
I was just going to share at a school that I'm working with, we were really talking with the kindergarten, first, second grade teachers, just that idea of starting with morphology. You don't have to wait until they're older. It's so important to just
Right.
start building that and having the
Mhm.
kids understand the different meanings that those carry.
Absolutely. And you can start with base words and affixes and suffixes. Like everybody, kids know the word play. If I play, if I'm doing it now, what am I doing? Playing. So play is the base word, ing is a suffix that makes the base word say what's happening now. If I did it yesterday, what did I do? I played. How did you change it? I added the suffix ed, which makes the base word tell what happened in the past. So those are really good ways to just start building that vocabulary, and then you can start teaching more complicated things, the prefixes and the bases. Okay, so in sum, here's what I've learned. Teaching reading requires a deep knowledge of English. We can never know enough. Close assessment of each child to meet their particular learning needs, a sense of how each child learns, and deep, extensive training and lots of practice. It is rocket science. That's no joke. Developing children may learn a new word or concept in 1 or 4 repetitions, but a dyslexic kid may need 10 times more than that. Sometimes they learn it and they can recall it, but sometimes they can't. Sometimes a lot of kids have issues with what they call random automatic naming. So it's in their brain, but they can't pull it out. And how many of you see kids that do that? They kind of know it, but they just can't say it. And they know it. How many of you have done that yourself? Where you're like, God, I know it, but I just can't recall it. So some dyslexic kids live in that space. That reinforcement and repetition wins the day. And when we're planning a new lesson, there's only one new concept, the rest is review. And did I mention that prevention trumps intervention? So interventions that are made in the 4th grade take 4 times longer than if we get it in kindergarten, 4 times. And we've wasted 4 years of that kid's life while we're at it. So neurology matters. There are differences between typically developing and dyslexic brains. We can build neural networks through structured literacy, and we can strengthen them. Even our kids that are good readers are only going to get better with structured literacy. Dyslexic brains may take more. So rather than changing and looking for intervention programs, just do more of what you're already doing. They don't need to learn new processes and new stuff. If you're using UFly and they need intervention, just do more UFly. Just pick the parts that they need. All kids benefit from structured literacy, and be relentlessly cumulative. So I am going to continue learning and growing. I'm doing another training next month called Build, which works with like the kindergarten, 1st grade, and learning how to support those kids, because our OG program really starts for like 7 years old. I want to learn how to support those younger kids so we can get them before they're behind. And I'm going to keep building my 600 hours towards my practicum. I recommend, if you'd like more information, to join the International Dyslexia Association, get some training in OG, and keep digging into this stuff. Has anybody done the letters training? It's interesting how California has not really, I mean, there are whole states that have supported their teachers in getting letters training, but California has not. It's interesting. Okay, these all are linked. There are great resources in all of these. California has a Reading League chapter, which offers a lot of great webinars for free, like the Sue Hugland webinar that I'm going to in a little bit. International Dyslexia Association, the Northern California branch, is the one that designed that simulation. So if you wanted to purchase that, you could get to them. There is an IDA branch if you're in the Los Angeles. IDA Los Angeles serves LA County, Kern County, Ventura, and San Diego, not San Diego, Santa Barbara. But there's an IDA Tri-Counties branch that serves San Bernardino, Orange County, and I can't remember the third one. There's also an IDA San Diego County branch. So get your local IDA branch and join them. The UCCSUs have a collaborative on neurodiversity and learning, and they created these dyslexia modules, which are great. This would be great PD. You could have teachers work through it together. Here's the TRL Reading League California branch, and they have great resources. Reading Universe has done a lot of incredible stuff. They have lots of great videos, model teaching. I'm going to get an overview of this, and she's coming to my class, actually, someone from here, but I highly recommend this site. Lots of free resources and teacher modeling and demo lessons of video teachers. So anyway, there's a lot of great stuff here. Feel free to dig into it. These are some of my favorite books if you want to read more about it. And some of the articles, if you need to give people background in any of this stuff, these three are the ones I would recommend. The Orton Gillingham is just sort of a basic background. The structured literacy and typical literacy process kind of compares what does a structured literacy lesson look like compared to typical lessons. And of course, I run a program training teachers to learn how to do intervention with kids with dyslexia. So if you're interested in that training, reach out to me, or if you just have any other questions.
All right, so I just wanted, just like Margaret was saying, but first of all, Margaret, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It was such an informative session, and I always learn so much from you. So thank you.
Thank you.
So coming soon, we're going to follow up with an email with this one pager. We're going to have resources linked, the slide deck that Margaret did today, as well as the recording, and then also just some key learnings, and also just a little call out that Project Arise, we have free asynchronous courses that you can enroll in, and you can go in any order and any pace that works for you. So we'll be sending that out on this one pager as well. And we'd also ask that if there's, we're also going to send you a certificate of participation, but if you need any documentation for completing professional learning hours, please just enter in the chat your first name, last name, and your email address, so we can ensure that you get that documentation that you need.
I'll take that. I think I get credit for this for my CEUs.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, you too.
Yes, thank you. And if you all wouldn't mind just taking a quick moment, we would love if you would provide some feedback for us about today's workshop. Let me copy this link and drop it in the chat. That's a giant link when I copied it.
So when I click on it, it took me to this preview something by Bitly.
Did not go on it?
Oh, wait, hang on. No, it did. Okay.
It did? It worked?
Yeah.
Okay.
It took a second. It started somewhere and then.
Okay, perfect.
Somewhere. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining at the end of what I know was a very long day. And I hope anybody have spring break coming up soon? Mine is next week, too, right in the nick of time. So have a nice spring break whenever you get to it.
Yes, thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate it.
Reach out if you have any other questions.
Thank you.